NATO summit convened in the one capital that bought Russia's S-400 air defense system. Trump demanded Europe spend 5% of GDP on weapons money almost nobody had, then signaled the U.S. might not honor Article 5 if Russia attacked. Europe couldn't spend what Trump demanded, and it couldn't trust the alliance would survive. This is the story of how NATO fractured in real time. NATO summit convened in Ankara on July 7, 2026, in the one NATO capital that had purchased Russia's S-400 air defense system. Turkey had paid $2.5 billion for the missiles in 2019. When Washington discovered what Turkey had done, the response was swift and brutal: expulsion from the F-35 program. Expulsion. Turkey remained in NATO, but cut off from the weapons system that defined what the alliance actually was. The reason was stark: the S-400 doesn't just shoot missiles at radars. It collects data on stealth aircraft. The F-35 is built on invisibility radar can't see it, which is the entire advantage NATO built over the last 30 years. An S-400 in NATO territory could strip that invisibility away. So Washington locked Turkey out. For 7 years, Turkey accepted that punishment. It stayed in NATO. It paid its dues. But it also held something the alliance desperately needed: location. The straits to the Black Sea. The airspace between Europe and the Middle East. Turkey was in, but isolated. Now it was hosting the summit, the most fractious NATO meeting in a generation. Convened in the one capital the alliance had learned to distrust. Trump arrived that same day with a demand so extreme: 5% of GDP on defense, spending from every ally that it would force Europe to choose. Spend money it didn't have, or watch the alliance come apart. And Turkey, the awkward partner in the room, was about to extract a price for its hospitality that would redefine the entire partnership. Within 24 hours, Trump signaled what he was willing to give. On July 7th, Trump stood at the podium in Ankara and declared something that made every European capital sit up. 5% of GDP on defense spending was non-negotiable. It was no longer an aspiration. It was a demand. Most NATO allies weren't even close. In 2025, the average was around 2%. The United States was at 3%. Trump had looked at these numbers and declared them insufficient, that if Europe wanted to call itself a military alliance, it had to spend like 5% of GDP. That's what the U.S. spent through much of the Cold War. It was more than any European country was ready to commit to. Trump had leverage, and he knew it. The U.S. still provided Europe's nuclear umbrella. American bases dotted the continent. American early warning systems watched Russian movements. And Trump, unpredictably, had suggested during his campaign that Article 5 NATO core promise that an attack on one is an attack on all might not be automatic. Europe couldn't ignore that threat. So when Trump spoke in Ankara, Europe listened. But it also did the math. 5% of GDP meant cuts so deep that pensions and healthcare would have to take the hit. Greece would need to find an extra 2 percentage points of GDP, roughly $10 billion a year, on top of its current budget. Poland needed 0.5 points more. Even allies already spending heavily would face a choice: raise taxes on populations already stretched, or cut social spending that kept them in power. The question became immediate: could Europe actually do this? Or was Trump demanding the impossible? Only Estonia and Lithuania currently spend 5% of GDP on defense, and they've suspended their normal fiscal rules to reach it. Poland sits at 4.5%, Greece at just 3%. For the rest of Europe, jumping to 5% means cutting pensions or raising taxes on populations already stretched. It's the kind of painful choice that destabilizes governments. That's the math every European cabinet had to confront. Trump didn't make demands in a vacuum. On July 7, 2026, the same day he opened the summit, he announced that the United States would lift CAATSA sanctions on Turkey's defense procurement agency. Those sanctions had been in place since December 2020, a direct punishment for Turkey's $2.5 billion S-400 purchase. Trump looked at Erdogan and said it plainly: the sanctions were coming off. Turkey would be readmitted to the F-35 program. It was a gift, but it was also a message: comply with the 5% demand, and maybe there's something in it for you too. Erdogan publicly claimed Trump had promised him 5 F-35 and signaled discussions on engines for Turkey's indigenous Khan fighter. For a country locked out of NATO weapons since 2019, this reversal rewrote the alliance's entire calculus. What Trump was demonstrating was pure leverage. He had tools to reward compliance. Spend 5% and you might get access to American weapons. You've been difficult, but host my summit and play ball, and your isolation ends. The message was clear to every European capital. Trump was using his first days at NATO to show that he could enforce his demands, and that compliance came with rewards. Turkey had just become the proof of concept. That leverage would echo through every budget meeting from Berlin to Paris to Warsaw. Buried in the summit's final text was something that mattered far more than Trump's theatrics. NATO allies had pledged euros 70 billion, roughly $80 billion, in military aid for Ukraine in 2026. On paper, it looked like solidarity. In reality, it was a retreat. At Washington in 2024, NATO had declared Ukraine on an irreversible path to membership. At The Hague in 2025, that language had already started to slip. Now in Ankara in 2026, it was gone completely. The alliance had committed weapons, tanks, air defense systems, ammunition, but it had abandoned any language suggesting Ukraine would ever actually join NATO. The euros 70 billion was real. But notice what wasn't in the declaration: new membership benchmarks. No timetable. No signal that Ukraine's accession was anything but indefinite waiting. Italy had fought to keep even financial guarantees out of the final text. Estonia had proposed a binding commitment that every NATO member spends 0.25% of GDP on Ukraine aid. That got killed by 5 countries: the UK, France, Spain, Italy, and Canada before the summit even opened. They didn't want to commit. They wanted flexibility. Ukraine's President Zelensky attended a dinner on Tuesday, but was excluded from the main summit sessions, a deliberate signal. Ukraine was a recipient of aid, not a future member with a voice in its own future. The alliance was saying, "We'll arm you. We'll fund you. But we won't commit to making you one of us." It was the most consequential language in the Ankara Declaration precisely because it wasn't there. Here's the trap the flowchart shows. Trump demands Europe spend 5% on defense, but he simultaneously made Article 5 conditional, uncertain whether America will show up if Russia attacks. Europe can't plan for 5% spending if the alliance might not exist. It can't prepare for war, and it can't plan for peace. The demand and the uncertainty cancel each other out. The only winner is the fracture itself. Everything that happens next depends on whether Europe can actually mobilize. The raw numbers are stark. To go from 2% to 5% spending across the EU would require finding roughly $300 billion a year in new defense spending. That's money most budgets don't have. It means cutting elsewhere, or raising taxes, or running massive deficits. Poland can do it. It's been building military capacity for years. The Baltics can do it. They already are. But Germany, France, Spain, they'd have to rewrite their entire fiscal strategy. There's a second problem: production capacity. Even if Europe found the money, European defense manufacturers couldn't build the equipment fast enough. Rheinmetall, the German tank maker, is already at maximum capacity. Airbus Defense can't accelerate production without years of capital investment. So Europe would end up buying American, which means dollar outflows, strategic dependence, and leverage for Washington. That's the trap. Europe has to spend 5% to keep NATO credible, but spending 5% will drain its budget and lock it into buying American weapons it can't manufacture itself. By the end of 2026, we'll know whether Europe is serious. Are governments passing budgets with massive defense increases? Are defense manufacturers signing new contracts? Or are they delaying, hoping this crisis passes? Europe's answer determines whether post-Trump NATO survives as a real alliance or becomes a hollow agreement that fractures the moment an actual threat arrives. Ankara didn't resolve this. An alliance can't spend for war if it can't count on peacetime loyalty. Europe will either break NATO spending targets and show resolve, or accept that the alliance survives in name only. That choice comes down to 2027. I'm David.